There may be no other dramatic cinematic device in movies that is so simultaneously hated en masse and overused consistently for effect than the jump scare. I'm sure none of you need it, but I guess it's worth defining the jump scare for the 0.001% watching that are unfamiliar with it. You've definitely encountered it if you've watched a horror movie made over the last 50 years. A jump scare is a sudden action or abrupt sound meant to startle the audience, and that's really all there is. And at least in an embryonic state, this simple shock device has been with us since the advent of film. Movie pioneer George Melly's made a huge number of horror shorts, even as capturing images on celluloid was in its infancy, and you can find jump scares galore in films like Le Manoir du Diable and The Damnation of Faust. In modern cinema, Brian De Palma's 1976 adaptation of Stephen King's Carrie ended with a jump scare that every horror movie since has seemingly tried to emulate. Carrie White's charred hand bursting from her grave to ensnare Sue Snell was a big moment for moviegoers. It was one final scare in a truly masterful movie, and it became water cooler conversation fodder at work and swings at chatter for those children lucky enough to see it. I did, a few years after it left theaters on CBS in 1978, on a black and white television. Don't ask how I remember this stuff, it's too deeply ingrained in who I am. And then there's Friday the 13th. Dead boy Jason Voorhees leaping from the water was a direct copy of Carrie's ending, but it somehow upped the ante. Funny how so many of the principal creatives that worked on the movie want to take credit for the sequence when it's so clear what inspired it. In both cases, the final girl awakens after the jump scare. Friday wore it better, though, by adding a brief bit of disquieting melancholy as Alice states that he's still there. And just as Jason would return many, many more times, so would the jump scare. But wait, when did it become so hated? Overuse is a common answer, but let's face it, the horror community isn't exactly opposed to seeing the same thing over and over. I mean, how many Halloween sequels are there now? And it's also not as if the jump scares aren't being staged or executed well. You'll find a ton of them in the Conjuring and Insidious franchises, and they produce gasps still, but now those quick inhalations are followed inevitably by groans. So what gives? What has changed? It's impossible to pinpoint the exact moment when the jump scare jumped the shark as an objective thing, but I can certainly tell you the moment I started rolling my eyes at them. 1986 Witchboard isn't a bad movie in many ways, but it's overloaded with cheap moments like hands being dropped suddenly on shoulders. It's ridiculous how many examples there are in this movie. Witchboard is kinda a perfect example of not when the jump scare became a problem, but rather why it happened. Let's go back to Friday the 13th again. Part 2, actually. In that film, first film survivor Alice wakes up from a nightmare in which she recounts the events of the original film. She mopes around her house, attempts to take a shower, gets a phone call from her mom, starts to make some tea, and then a cat leaps through a window. The pace of all those early events is completely at contrast with the jump scare, which is why it works. Think Exorcist 3. It's about build-up. Jump scares rely on shock to be effective, but the best jump scares utilize suspense leading up to the boo moment. But that's only half of the story as to why Friday Part 2's jump scare works. Thing is, the audience calms down, maybe even laughs. The cat's a cheap scare for sure, but then she opens the refrigerator door and finds Mrs. Voorhees' head waiting for her, and Jason attacks her from behind. The jump scare forced us to let our guard down just long enough for the real scare to hit us. It's misdirection, and that's way different than the ones you'll find in Witchboard. How the jump scare is used is pretty clearly an important ingredient, but there's something I think is more crucial yet. It's about stakes. If you want to jolt a viewer, you do well to make sure that the scare has actual consequences for the characters on screen or the plot at large. If the scare is just there to provoke a 2-second reaction out of the audience, it comes off as cheap. But if something abrupt happens that has real impact on a character's safety in the story, it plays different. It feels authentic and earned, and maybe even effectively drops the viewer into the protagonist's point of view. You feel what they feel in that moment. A great example of this can be found in Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. When Stretch is forced to give Chop Top an impromptu tour of the record station, we're watching Bill Moseley like a hawk. We're worried about what he'll do. When Leatherface emerges from the record vault with chainsaw roaring, it's a big shock. But the thing is, there's no audience laughter. No one is thinking, oh, you got us with that one, because there isn't time. Stretch is about to get cut into pieces, so we have no opportunity to exhale. Let's take a quick step backwards for a moment. Why do we watch horror movies? Sure, there's as many answers to that as there are viewers of these movies, but I think we can agree that the very best movies that the genre has to offer all make us feel things, maybe scared or grossed out or upset or paranoid, but something. Jump scares that don't have impact harm these movies because the viewer is ejected right out of the narrative on screen. They become very aware that a stupid trick has been played on them. Maybe they can re-engage with the movie in a moment or so, but for a little while they're well aware of the movie theater and other moviegoers around them. And that's not healthy for audience investment. It's also just lazy. A loud sound on the soundtrack and something jumping into frame is shockingly easy to accomplish. Do you remember all those dumbass videos in the early days of YouTube where a pretty girl would just stare back at you for a couple minutes before there would be a quick cut to a scary face and a loud scream would assault your ears? Those idiotic videos all get the job done, but does it have any lasting impact beyond a quick tightening of your shoulders and fists? Nope, it's easy and cheap and lazy and pointless. No thanks. I'm not saying that there's no place for shock tactics in horror. The opposite, in fact. Whether it's the chest burster in Alien or the heart attack bite in The Thing, jump scares that impact the story and characters on screen can be incredible ways to get exactly the right reaction out of viewers. It just gets dicey when jump scares are used to pad out the running time. I'm sure you're aware of Brandon Tenold, the Canadian YouTuber. He doesn't call them jump scares, he prefers the term fake-out scares, and while I find the wording of that title a little garbled, it actually gets closer to the truth. When the skullish face of the beast bursts out of the closet portal in Poltergeist, it's both a big shock and an important moment in the story. It's anything but a fake-out scare. Is the presence of cheap jump scares a deal breaker for me? No, not really. Some of my favorite films have one or two of them, but the ratio of real scares to jump scares needs to make sense. Challenge my senses with concepts and emotions. Beat down my defenses with moments of real peril and characters I care about. Maybe then you can earn a few random boo moments. But don't feed us McDonald's and claim it's a gourmet meal. We can tell the difference every time.